There was a fourth baby, whom for a moment authorities believed had been easily identified. She had been pulled from Caversham Weir on April the 23rd. 5-month-old Frances Jessie Goulding was born on November the 20th, 1894. Her mother was Elizabeth Goulding, a young woman from Gloucester. The baby's father, Charles Aldridge, was a wealthy hotel owner and a married man. As he had no intention of leaving his wife for young Elizabeth Goulding, baby Frances was cared for by her aunt, Elizabeth Carter. The arrangement worked well until Elizabeth Carter received a letter from Mrs. Aldridge, the wife of the baby's father. Mrs. Aldridge wanted her husband's affair to be covered up and for the family's respectability to be preserved. She was adamant that in order to do this, baby Frances had to be sent away and adopted. So Elizabeth Goulding met with Mary Ann Palmer at a solicitor's office on September the 9th, 1895. £10 changed hands and a legal agreement was written up. They then went to Gloucester train station where Miss Goulding said her last goodbyes to baby Frances. Mary Ann kept in touch with Elizabeth's aunt, Mrs. Carter, but her correspondences were dishonest. She told her that they lived in the country and that her husband was a wealthy farmer and that he adored little Frances. The two continued to keep in touch until Mrs. Carter asked to visit. By the end of 1895, Mary Ann Palmer had stopped writing altogether, and in January of 1896, Mrs. Carter's letters were being returned, with a note saying that the occupants had moved away. An inquest was held for Frances Jessie Goulding on Friday, May the 1st, 1896. Elizabeth Goulding travelled to Reading and identified some of the clothing belonging to Frances. A lock of hair was also produced, which Elizabeth also declared belonged to her daughter. When Mary Ann Palmer stood in the dock, she stated that baby Frances had been passed to a new adoptive mother the day after she had been received in Gloucester. A Miss Robb from Birmingham, who was an actress, was the woman in question. She had had a baby with a man who agreed to help pay for the child's care as long as it survived. When the child passed away, Miss Robb said that she needed a decoy baby to continue receiving money, so she turned to Mary Ann Palmer and they arranged the adoption for Frances Goulding. This of course raises questions regarding the communication between Mrs. Carter and Mary Ann Palmer, and Palmer's empty talk of a country home and a loving husband. When questioned about this, Mary Ann said that she chose not to tell the woman the truth and invented the scenario to save her further anxiety. At the end of proceedings, Coroner William Weedon expressed his belief that Amelia Dyer had murdered Frances Jessie Goulding and that Mary Ann Palmer was not only guilty of bringing the child to Reading, but was also an accessory in her murder. However, it was impossible to prove beyond doubt that the baby found in the Thames was Frances. Regardless of the baby's identity though, there was no doubt that she had been murdered, so it was up to the jury to decide whether Mary Ann had lied in court to protect her mother. That was certainly the opinion of Coroner Weedon. He said that her answers were, quote, hesitant and unsatisfactory. The jury took just 5 minutes to reach a verdict of willful murder against Amelia Dyer, with Mary Ann Palmer being charged as an accessory. Mary Ann was then taken from the court to be joined with her mother in prison to await her own trial. The highly publicised hearing opened on April the 11th, 1896. Among the witnesses were Jane Smith, Willie Thornton, Evelyn Marmon and Amelia Sargent. Initially, neither Amelia Dyer or Alfred Palmer had legal representation. There was no doubt that Dyer could afford it considering the money she had made, but clearly being under no illusions as to her eventual fate, she was reported to have said that paying a solicitor would be like throwing money away. Evelyn Marmon, whose name was found among the letters at Dyer's house, was brought to Reading and identified her daughter that morning. Amelia Sargent, the former carer of Harry Simmons, identified his body from a police photograph. Both Sargent and Harmon were called to officially identify Dyer from a lineup of 4 women. In floods of tears, Miss Marmon pointed to Dyer, while Mrs. Sargent exclaimed, "That's the vile creature who had the little fellow." Evelyn Marmon also identified the carpet bag in which her daughter was found as the same one Amelia Dyer was carrying when they met. During the hearing, it was said that there had been a sighting of Amelia Dyer and Doris Marmon at Gloucester railway station, but when a station attendant helped Dyer out of the carriage at Swindon, where she must have changed trains, Doris was nowhere to be seen. It was believed that Dyer had strangled Doris somewhere between the 2 stations, placed her in the carpet bag, and then continued on to London, where she visited Mary Ann and Arthur Palmer at their home on the 31st of March. Evelyn Marmon fainted in the dock as the details of her daughter's fate were described. Willie Thornton identified the carpet bag which contained the bodies of Doris and Harry as belonging to him. Young Willie, who was praised by the judge for his clear and honest account, recalled that one day he'd noticed a foul smell coming from the kitchen cupboard. There he found a small brown paper parcel. He didn't touch it, but said that later that day it had been covered with a cloth, and shortly after that it had disappeared. When looking at photographs of the deceased children, Jane Smith broke down when she recognised the golden-haired child she had become particularly fond of. Considering all that she must have seen during her time with Dyer, Jane Smith didn't speak ill of the woman until the hearing, when she said, "She was very cruel to them. She used to shake the little baby in a shocking manner." She also stated that Amelia Dyer thought more of her pet cats than she did of the children, and said that when she recently visited her in Reading Prison, she got the impression that she was pretending to be mad. Jane Smith's statement sounded very much like a woman finally able to speak the truth, after years of silence for fear of reproach. She added that she knew nothing of the baby's fates, and never took them from the house herself, describing an honest and practical role in the household. She also spoke of how the house at Kensington Road had become a morbid attraction for sightseers, with people gathering outside to take a look at the house of the baby killer. Jane Smith explained that one evening 2 men claiming to be police officers searched the house. She said that she thought it likely that they were just brazen tourists or journalists hoping to get a closer look at the House of Horrors. As the details of the hearing made the national papers, letters poured in from concerned parents wanting to reclaim their children. So many, in fact, that 2 police officers were assigned to reply to them. Meanwhile, in Devonport, Plymouth, police had recognised Arthur Palmer's portrait, which had been circulated by Reading Police. They knew him to be a man responsible for abandoning a 4-year-old girl named Queenie Baker in the city of Plymouth the previous year. They reissued a warrant for his arrest and sent it to the police station at Reading. At the end of the hearing, it was agreed by the jury that Dyer had disposed of the children's bodies, but the coroner stated that there was not enough evidence to prove that she had actually murdered them. However, the inquest into the deaths of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons came to a close that same day. The final verdict in both cases came back as willful murder against Mrs. Dyer, with Arthur Palmer being named as an accessory. On hearing this, both Amelia Dyer and Arthur sought legal representation. The final day of the Reading child murders hearing was to take place on the 2nd of May. At the opening of the final day, Dyer appeared haggard, while Palmer seemed unconcerned, an aura he'd maintained throughout the proceedings. Arthur explained that he and his wife were good, honest people, were unaware of Dyer's activities, and certainly had not profited from them. It was agreed that there was not enough evidence against Arthur Palmer to proceed, and he was formally discharged. He stepped down from the dock with a carefree air about him, only to be immediately arrested as he stepped out of the courtroom for the abandonment of 4-year-old Queenie Baker in Plymouth. He foolishly claimed that he'd never been to the city, despite there being considerable evidence to prove that he'd lived there for some time. He was immediately taken to Devonport to face a new trial. What little defence Amelia Dyer might have had fell apart after the letters she had written in Reading Prison to her family and Chief Constable Chewsley were produced. In fact, Amelia Dyer's new defence solicitor, Mr. Shapori Kapadia, attempted to stop the letters from being used as evidence. This is not surprising as they contained a pretty damning account, but the objection was overruled. As there were no witnesses for the defence, Amelia Dyer was formally charged with the willful murder of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons. She was committed to trial at the Old Bailey in London. When Dyer was taken from the court to be escorted to Holloway Prison, where she would await her trial, she was faced by an angry crowd. Hundreds of outraged people awaiting the outcome of the hearing booed, hissed and screamed at Dyer as she was hurried to a waiting car. She was taken to Reading train station accompanied by 3 police officers. As the train steamed out of Reading bound for London, Dyer took one last glimpse at Caversham Lock and burst into tears. She got the same angry reception in London as a mob had gathered. 2 lines of police officers had to protect her as she was bundled into a taxi and taken to Holloway Prison. 2 days later, on the 4th of May, Arthur Palmer stood trial in Devonport for the abandonment of Queenie Baker on the 17th of May 1895. She was found wandering the streets alone. His former Devonport landlady identified him and proceeded to give evidence, telling the story of a poor girl who was often neglected and ultimately abandoned. After such compelling evidence, Palmer was sent to prison with hard labour for a period of 3 months. Following her ordeal, Queenie was adopted. It was later reported that her anxious state was much improved and that she was living happily. Amelia Dyer's trial began on the 21st of May 1896 under Judge Sir Henry Hawkins. She pleaded not guilty to the murder of Doris Marmon, but her defence tried an insanity plea, reminding the judge that her mother had suffered from mental breakdowns, suggesting that the condition was hereditary. But based on the letters she had written during her remand period in Reading Prison, it was agreed that they were by the hand of a woman who was, quote, perfectly sane. When called to the dock, Mary Ann Palmer gave a detailed account of the events at 76 Mayo Road, Willesden, a statement I'll refer to heavily in Part 1. In an apparent attempt to uphold the insanity plea, Palmer also detailed her mother's past mental breakdowns, reminding the court that she had spent a considerable amount of time in various asylums. A number of medical professionals were then called to give their opinions of Dyer's state of mind. Dr. J. Lacey Firth, who had examined Dyer following her suicide attempt at the Ashton Park Brook, disagreed with the general consensus that she was of sound mind. This view was shared by Dr. Littleton Stewart Forbes Winslow, who interviewed Dyer at length a week before her trial began. It was his belief that she was suffering from insanity and delusions, and that she was not responsible for her actions. But the final verdict was based on the opinion of Dr. George Henry Savage, the most experienced psychiatrist to tend to Mrs. Dyer. He said that there was nothing to suggest that the children had died as a result of, quote, homicidal mania, and deemed Amelia Dyer sane. Dyer claimed that she had no recollection of her crimes, she didn't know how many children had been found, and felt that she had dreamt the whole thing. When asked by Dr. Savage about the murders, she said that she knew nothing about them, adding that if she had carried them out, she must have been mad, because, after all, she was very fond of children. As the day was drawing to a close, there was still one last witness yet to enter the court. It was 67-year-old James Hobley, Amelia's brother, now estranged for 35 years. With total disregard, he said that there had never been any mental illness in the family, adding that Amelia was a total stranger to him. It was 8:30 p.m. when the jury retired. After less than 5 minutes, they returned with the verdict of guilty. Judge Hawkins then donned his black cap and handed down the death sentence. While awaiting her execution, which was to take place at Newgate Prison on Wednesday the 10th of June, the now 56-year-old Dyer went on a hunger strike and made another failed attempt on her own life, using the same method she had on the children. She wound her bootlaces around her neck and tied a knot, but was found by a prison warder before she expired. When she recovered, she wrote a full confession, which was said to be 5 exercise books long. In them she exonerated her daughter and her son-in-law of all blame and confessed to her crimes. One statement read, "What was done I did do myself. My only wonder is that I did not murder all in the house when I had these awful temptations on me." The day before her execution, 3 men, Henry Fowler, Albert Milsom and William Seaman, were hanged for murder in a triple execution. That evening, Dyer was moved from Newgate and returned to Holloway Prison so that she would not hear the toll of the bell announcing their demise. When the executions were over, she was returned to Newgate Prison, but to reach her cell, she had to walk past their newly dug graves. The Central Somerset Gazette, dated the 13th of June 1896, described her final hours. Morning broke dull and misty. The elements seemed to sympathise with the forthcoming tragedy. The first light found Dyer awake and restless. The concluding scene was terrible. The convict seemed unable to move. She regarded those around her with a glassy stare, and when the female warders approached, she shrank from them with a shudder of horror. Her limbs seemed palsied and her mind a blank. The executioner dexterously slipped the noose around the neck of the doomed woman. The bolt was drawn and the black-robed figure fell. Dyer weighed no less than 180 pounds. Billington had allowed a drop of only 5 feet and a few inches. She died immediately. The last public execution in Britain took place in 1868, so Amelia Dyer's hanging was carried out behind the walls of Newgate Prison. After a black flag was raised to signal her death, Dyer's body was left to hang for an hour. She was buried within the prison grounds. On the day of her death, the contents of Dyer's last home at 45 Kensington Road were auctioned to cover rent owed to the landlord. The morbid contents, which included tables, chairs, cots and piles of baby clothes, made £7.15, the equivalent of £450 today. Just before her execution, Amelia Dyer was subpoenaed to appear as a witness at her daughter's trial for aiding Dyer in the murder of Francis Jesse Goulding, which was set for Wednesday, June the 17th, a week after her execution date. However, it was ruled in the House of Commons that Dyer's execution would not be postponed, and any evidence given by her in the meantime would be inadmissible in court. The charges against Mary Ann Palmer were ultimately dropped at the Reading courtroom when it was decided that the child the coroner had examined, and whose death the trial was about, may not have been Francis Jesse Goulding after all, but an as yet unidentified child. This was despite her mother Elizabeth Goulding confidently identifying her hair and clothing. To confuse matters, Jane Smith said that she recognised the child as one she cared for and had named Little Ike, because she remembered the child's surname was Isaacs. But that child, as far as she knew, came from London and not Gloucester. Mary Ann Palmer's claims that Francis was alive and had been adopted by a woman called Miss Robb from Birmingham were never verified. The children who lived with Amelia Dyer at the time of her arrest had already left Reading by the time she went to trial, either being reunited with their natural parents or rehomed. Willie Thornton's mother collected him, and for a while it looked as if Nellie Oliver would be adopted. That is until her mother was located in Cornwall, and with whom she was reunited. Jane Smith was forced to return to Barton Regis Women's Workhouse. A year after the trial, Chief Constable Chewsley retired due to ill health. Detective Constable James B.T. Anderson remained with the Reading Police Force, being promoted to Inspector by 1910. Amelia Dyer's natural son, William Samuel Dyer, who was out of the country during his mother's trial, enlisted in the Royal Marine Artillery and rose to the rank of sergeant. He married, eventually settled back in England and had at least one son. He died in 1959 at the age of 83. Baby Harold Palmer, the adopted son of Mary Ann and Arthur, was taken to live in a workhouse following his parents' involvement in the Amelia Dyer case. Sadly, he died shortly thereafter. The cause of death was recorded as marasmus or wasting away. He was laid to rest at Willesden New Cemetery. Considering she had been involved in baby farming for between 20 and 30 years, it's thought that Amelia Dyer could have been responsible for the deaths of as many as 400 children. Her crime spree, unsurprisingly when you consider the distances she covered, were thought to have extended beyond the south of England. For example, on the 24th of April 1896, an infant's body was recovered from Manchester's canal, weighed down by a piece of granite. Just like in the cases of the children in the Thames, the infant was found with white tape wrapped around the neck, and a knot tied just beneath the right ear. Although never confirmed as a victim of Amelia Dyer, it was highly suspected. Also, it's known that during the Dyer family's short stint in Cardiff, they took in at least one child, a baby aged 9 months. The baby's fate was never established, but 2 weeks after they had moved to Cardiff, the body of an infant was pulled from the River Severn. How the child came to be in the River Severn was never established, and with no leads, the circumstances behind its death forever remained a mystery. The horrified residents of Reading and beyond visited Clapper's footbridge over the years and carved wooden crosses into the handrail in the memory of innocent victims whose stories, save for a few, were never told. The wooden bridge has since been replaced. Curiously, in 1895, 40 babies were found in the Thames in London, specifically between Battersea and Wapping. It makes you wonder how many of these could have been attributed to Amelia Dyer, especially as they had all been found since August of 1895, which is when she moved to Caversham. She was known to travel to the capital to collect children, but there was never any evidence to link these London babies to Dyer. During Amelia Dyer's time spent in Bristol, it's known she moved around a lot. It's not easy to accurately trace her steps, but one other house she occupied for a time was No. 1 Grove Cottage on Grove Road in the Fishponds area. By 1902 that house was occupied by a Mr. Walter Hawkes, and in June of that year, whilst digging close to an apple tree at the bottom of the garden, his spade turned up part of a baby's dress at a depth of about 18 inches. As he dug other areas of the garden, he unearthed 3 complete infant skeletons. All, he said, were wrapped in canvas and donned the remnants of the clothes they were buried in. When separate inquests were held for each child, their ages were said to have ranged from 14 months to 6 years. When all tenants of 1 Groves Cottage from the past 10 years were traced, it was realised that Amelia Dyer had lived there for a short period in 1894. Attempts were made to trace Mary Ann Palmer, but they proved fruitless. In July of 1902, it was decided that the search for Palmer was pointless, because even if they did find her, a prosecution would be extremely unlikely, as past evidence suggested that it was her mother who was involved, and besides, due to their full decomposition, there was no way of knowing how they died. In 2017, an extraordinary discovery was made by the great-great-grandson of one of Amelia Dyer's arresting officers, Detective Constable James Beattie Anderson. The man found a package in a relative's attic, which is thought to be the original parcel in which Helena Fry was found in Caversham Weir, as well as the string used to tie the parcel and the tape found around her neck. The well-preserved package is now held at the Thames Valley Police Museum in Reading, where a number of artefacts from Amelia Dyer's crimes are housed, as fascinating yet grim reminders of one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. Throughout the Amelia Dyer story, we are reminded of the heartbroken, misled parents who were promised a life of happiness for their children, and the letters written by Dyer to that effect. Not surprisingly, when headlines hit the tabloids, letters flooded in from parents who wanted to reclaim their children. But London's Weekly Dispatch, in June of 1896, printed letters written by parents who were not only happy for their child to be discarded, but feared that they themselves would be implicated in Dyer's crimes. One such letter, found at Dyer's home, reads, "You can do your best and do your worst. I don't care what you do with Jessie. She is yours now, not mine. I was only too glad to see a chance of getting rid of what would prove a drag on me my whole lifetime." Another letter, referring to a child named Georgie, reads, "You'll remember I gave you £5 in order to get rid of my child, and although it was now 5 years ago, I will see you in hell before I own the child or pay any more. You can do what you wish with it for all I care." The last example is from a letter sent to Dyer at Reading Prison while she awaited her trial. "For God's sake, keep your tongue still. You can gain nothing by showing me up. No one knows how much I gave you or ever will. I am married and my husband knows nothing of my shame, and if you say anything, it means ruin for life, to me and all belonging to me." Mary Ann and Arthur, whilst living with Amelia at Piggott's Road, adopted a child they renamed Ina Clara Palmer, who died at the address on the 20th of October 1895. She was just 2 months old and her death was due to starvation. Ina had been given into the Palmers' care by her birth mother, who was from Swindon. Ina died a few weeks later, but her death was not viewed as suspicious enough to warrant an investigation. Baby Ina was laid to rest at Caversham Cemetery. 2 years after Dyer's execution, railway workers inspecting train carriages at Newton Abbot in Devon found a parcel tucked beneath a seat. Inside there was a 3-week-old girl. She was cold and wet, but alive. Her name was Jane Hill, daughter of Anne Hill, and she had been given to one Mrs. Stewart for adoption for the sum of £12. It transpired that she had been collected from Plymouth by Mrs. Stewart and then abandoned on the next train. Mrs. Stewart was eventually tracked down to an address in Oxford and was in fact Mary Ann Palmer. Both Mary Ann and Arthur were charged with abandonment of a child and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labour. Annie Panter was a young mother of 3 who resided at 6 Somerset Place, Caversham, a short distance from Amelia Dyer's last home. On the 30th of March 1896, the same day that the body of Helena Fry was pulled from the river, and the day that began the unravelling of Dyer's diabolic crimes, another baby, also wrapped in a small parcel, was discovered beneath the mattress of Annie Panter, who had concealed it for weeks. Panter's landlord, Henry Newman, raised the alarm when he noticed a foul smell. He entered her room, found the parcel and forced Annie to open it. I don't know if Annie Panter knew Amelia Dyer, or if the child in question was at all linked to her baby farming operation. In Amelia Dyer's written confession just before her execution, she attempts to explain what became of some of the children in her care. There is a mention of an instance from the 11th of October 1895, when she claims to have been lost in the Paddington district of London whilst carrying a child. Not knowing what to do, she stopped at Holy Trinity Church on Bishop's Road and left the child at the door. The baby was found the same day and taken into care at a local woman's workhouse, where she was renamed Amy Church. In the wake of Amelia Dyer's execution, new laws were passed regarding child welfare. There was a new national realisation that the abandoned children of Britain deserved more. The business known as baby farming wasn't outlawed, but it was more strictly regulated. However, this new approach still failed to stop Annie Walters and Amelia Sack, the baby farmers from Finchley. It's unbelievable when you consider that while Amelia Sack conducted business from her home on Stanley Road, and later Hertford Road, her partner in crime, Annie Walters, rented a room at the home of a police officer. He eventually raised the alarm when he became suspicious of their activities, even using his young daughter to gain their trust and glean information. It was discovered that Walters and Sack had been poisoning young children using chlorodyne, which was another 19th century medicine containing laudanum, after receiving money for their care. When Annie Walters was arrested in 1902 in Kensington, she was carrying the dead body of a child she had received £25 for. It was confirmed that at least 5 children had died at their hand from starvation and neglect. When the Finchley home was raided, 10 children were found, all barely alive. Only 2 of those survived. It's believed that, either working together or independently, they could have been responsible for the deaths of as many as 100 children. They were the first women to be hanged at Holloway Prison on the 3rd of February 1903. The executioner was William Billington, the son of Amelia Dyer's executioner James Billington. Ada Chard Williams was active in London in 1899. She used similar methods to Amelia Dyer both in obtaining her victims and her methods of killing. Convicted in 1900 of beating and strangling 21-month-old Selina Ellen Jones and throwing her body in the River Thames the previous year, Ada Chard Williams was hanged at Newgate Prison on the 6th of March 1900. Selina Jones was her only confirmed victim, although she was suspected of killing others. Rhoda Willis, also known as Leslie James, was sentenced to death in Cardiff following a prison confession to a fellow inmate. The victim in question, who died on the 3rd of June 1899, was the day-old baby of a woman named Maud Treasure. Rhoda Willis, while lodging with Mr. and Mrs. Wilson in Cardiff, came home drunk one night and fell out of bed. When Mrs. Wilson went to her aid, she discovered a dead child in the bed. The infant was the newborn baby of Maud Treasure. Rhoda Willis had promised Miss Treasure that she would raise the baby herself, having received £6 for the adoption. After Rhoda Willis had collected the child, she smothered her on a train somewhere between Llanishen Station and Cardiff Central. Willis was hanged at Cardiff Prison on the 14th of August 1907. It was her 40th birthday. She was the only woman to be hanged in Wales in the 20th century, and the last baby farmer to be executed in Britain. In 1908, a year after James's execution, the Children's Act was passed, which meant legal registration of foster parents and additional powers to local authorities to protect the children in their care.